My first question to you all is, how many American Indians live in the United States? I'm not including the indigenous peoples of Mexico who are on this land, but is it about 150,000, 500,000, 1 million, or 5 million? Who says 150,000? 500,000? 1 million? 5 million. So 5 million is correct. The second question is about how many federally acknowledged tribes, that's separate nations, First Nations, American Indian tribes, Pueblos, etc., exist on the territory of the United States. Less than 200, 200 to 500, or 500 or more. So who thinks less than 200? 200 to 500? 500 or more. So the answer is 500 or more. There are 568 federally acknowledged tribes, and there are hundreds more that have different statuses as tribal towns or as non-federally acknowledged tribes, state-recognized tribes, etc. So in this kind of space, I think a lot of people, a lot of anti-racists look at American Indian struggles and think these are folks who are racially oppressed, and that's certainly true. Racial oppression is a huge part of the Native struggle. It's a part of everyday experience for some folks, especially people who have darker skin tone than me. But I think the overlooked portion is the question of national oppression, specifically sovereignty. So tribes are sovereign, whether they are federally acknowledged or not. They exercise that sovereignty or demand that sovereignty and have different relational powers with the colonial government of the United States. In this day and time, the United States says that there is a nation-to-nation relationship between the United States government and tribes. However, dating all the way back to the 1820s with the Marshall Trilogy, there is this status of domestic dependent nation. This is a paternalistic relationship, like parent and child. And so even with the ideology that the United States now puts forth, which is that tribes are sovereign, the reality is that tribes are completely disallowed by law from having external relationships with other countries outside the United States. So the State Department doesn't like it. You know, if my tribe or some others wanted to, you know, make a treaty with Venezuela, for example, or Cuba, and actually, strangely enough, that happened. You know, after the Cuban Revolution, there were some Seminole people in Florida, Miccosukee people, traditionalists, who never left Florida, and the federal government did not want to acknowledge them as a tribe because they didn't go where the United States wanted them to go, to Oklahoma, and they demanded federal acknowledgement, and the government kept saying no. Well, after the revolution in Cuba, some of them got on a plane and flew to Havana and met with Fidel, and in almost no time, the United States government said, oh, yeah, we recognize you as a federally acknowledged tribe. So, you know, this question of domestic dependent status is huge. It is a functional erosion of sovereignty that's codified within the law. And this happened in the 1820s. Before that, the United States and all of the various colonial powers acknowledged that we were nations, whether we were big nations or small nations. They made treaties, just like the United States makes with Mexico or any other country. But from the 1820s, it began to be eroded, and after the Civil War, the Indian Appropriations Act in 1871 ended the treaty relationship. So if a tribe did not have treaties by that time with the United States said, we're not going to acknowledge you, we're not going to have treaties with you. And that was a huge erosion of sovereignty, followed almost immediately by The Dawes Act, which took reservations, especially in Oklahoma, but all around, and parceled them out to individuals. So, you know, the United States government has always been about individual property rights. And so they wanted to destroy our collective property rights. They created this Dawes Act for individual allotments. And basically, once things were allotted out over time, you know, the plan was to sell off, have people, through their impoverishment, sell off their lands, and the settlers could get the lands. You know, moreover, in Oklahoma, for example, the Dawes Act allowed so-called unused or excess lands to be purchased by settlers. Some who came early, this is what the Oklahoma Sooners are about. You know, these are the most virulent kind of land grabbing, you know, settlers. From the late 19th century throughout the 20th century, the United States government's relationship with tribes has been push and pull, has been horrible or slightly less horrible. In the 30s, there was a whole movement called the Indian New Deal, and in that period, tribes were allowed more self-determination, were encouraged to have constitutions, governments modeled like the United States, etc. But less than 20 years later, the government enacted a policy called termination. Their goal was to destroy tribes entirely. They gave up their relationship, their treaty relationship with many tribes, and said, we don't have a responsibility to you, because really, going back over 100 years, all we wanted to do was assimilate you anyway, or to paper genocide you away, you know, because the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the War Department before that, had a policy of blood quantum. They pushed this policy inside tribes saying what matters is how much Indian you are. You know, it was kind of an inverse thing to the one-drop rule, right? People know about the one-drop rule. So, you know, in the South you have one drop, you know, or the paper bag test or something. But amongst tribes, it was, if you're not 1/4 Indian, the United States government has no responsibility to you, or 1/8 Indian, or depending on what it is for what services. And so it was a kind of paper genocide as people outmarried. And not just a question of Indian by blood, but also which tribe you're in. And so you start intermarrying between tribes that are settled next to each other, and then all of a sudden you have these things called CDIB cards, you have these things called tribal registrations, you know, enrollments that in some cases require 50% blood quantum. So it's a kind of paper genocide. So I want to sort of stress that the Native struggle is not just a struggle of racial oppression, although it is, it's also a struggle for sovereignty. So everyone in the room familiar with the struggles of the 1960s and 70s in the American Indian movement? Could I have a show of hands who knows about AIM and that history? Something? So this was a great time, you know, after years, after termination, people started to fight back, and they started to fight back in organized form. The National Congress of American Indians was formed, which is a kind of more standard, I don't know, organization similar to the NAACP. It was a broad-based organization, but with individual Indian members and tribes. But there were also much more radical forces that began to organize, community organize. And out of this community organizing in the cities primarily, because as I started out saying, the majority of American Indians now are living off-res and in cities. So when the city-based movement, the urban Indian movement started and grew out of displacement of folks to the cities, and and resettlement that happened during the same period of termination of the 50s. Starting in the 60s, late 60s and the 70s, this powerful movement, American Indian movement, made strong demands. Occupied Alcatraz, occupied the BIA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and it had a rippling effect throughout Indian country, especially with young people in that period. Young people that, for the most part, were being drafted to go to Vietnam. And that symbol of power and pride resonated. And it resonated in my small community of Louisiana. And out of that, we started demanding our sovereignty. And tribes across the country who were having their leadership appointed by the President of the United States and not democratically elected started demanding their sovereignty. People started saying, no, we're not going to allow ourselves to be micromanaged by the BIA. And so, of course, we know a little bit about this movement and how it was infiltrated, just like the Black Power movement and the socialist movement in the period, COINTELPRO, etc. I'm not going to go into that. But that was a turning point. But for most of my lifetime, I haven't seen that kind of radicalism. I imagined that kind of radicalism, but I hadn't seen it. I saw it north of this colonial border in Canada, where First Nations people have been willing to do blockades and do all sorts of radical actions throughout the 80s and 90s. But I didn't see it so much where I lived. But in isolated pockets, people fight. They resist, they fight for water rights, they fight against the continuing theft of land. And when strong movements start, sometimes even on another side of a colonial border, it resonates. Idle No More resonated. Who here was inspired by Idle No More? Did anyone follow that? People were doing round dances in every city of the United States. People were coming out and protesting and making themselves visible. One of the biggest issues for American Indians were invisible in cities. Light-skinned people like myself, people might think, oh, that's a white dude. If you're a little darker, oh, that person's Mexican. If you're even darker, oh, that's African-American person. And part of that has to do with the centuries of colonial rule and intermarriage, but part of that just happens to be that people imagine that we don't exist. But this Idle No More movement and this movement against the Keystone XL pipeline, it really ignited things. So who here was aware and supportive of Standing Rock and the No DAPL movement? Yeah. Okay, so these movements continue. There's ups and downs, but the Idle No More and Fight Around Keystone made the No DAPL and Standing Rock protest that much bigger. And so I think now we're in a phase overall where Indigenous struggle is growing, where people are coming to a more radical framework, and people are saying, we don't want to be colonized. This is a country in which, in the history books, we always talk about the colonial period. Oh, the British colonial period, the French colonial period. Well, for some people on this land, the colonial period has not ended yet. And so I'll leave you with that. Thank you.